Hello. Today I've chosen to do my video on the nation of Cuba. Cuba is an island nation located in the northern Caribbean. It is located south of Florida and the Bahamas. It is west of Haiti and north of Jamaica. The Caribbean has such a rich history with all its island nations and territories like Puerto Rico. And out of all the Caribbean nations and islands, I would think that Cuba has the most history. I have not visited Cuba, but many would debate that. I say it's a fascinating place. Many would debate this. Of course, if you're a Cuban citizen and you've been oppressed by the Castro government, you might disagree with me. But if you're an American tourist from Florida that visits Havana, you might say it's the best place to be. It all depends on your personal experience. And I believe that Cuba will get better over the years, especially now that the U.S., thanks to Obama, is dealing with Cuba and opening Cuba up for trade. Cuba is the largest Caribbean island, and it's also the most populated nation in the Caribbean. Before the Spaniards colonized Cuba in the late 15th century, the native North American tribes inhabited the island. It remained as a Spanish colony up until the Spanish-American War. It became an American proctorate after the war, but it was a fragile republic. The Castro family rose to power at this time. In 1965, Cuba fell under the Communist Power Party, and Cuba became a major partner with the Soviet Union, which is now Russia. And this led to a near nuclear war over the Cuban Missile Crisis between the US and Cuba. It was stated that Russia was putting nuclear missiles in Cuba to deter a US invasion. And regarding culture, Cuba is considered a Latin American country. It's actually top of my list in Latin America to visit, even though I have visited Puerto Rico, which was tremendous. And it has extensive ethnic backgrounds. During Spanish colonialism, the Europeans brought African slaves to the island. Cuba is a Marxist-Leninist one-party republic, which, of course, is dominated by Russia. That's why Leninist came from Russia. Cuba has really followed the Soviet Union in all of its policies. Modern Cuba, again, thanks to President Obama, is becoming a better place to be. I think if you went to Miami, many people of Cuban descent would tell me that I'm wrong, and nothing's changing. And for the Cuban people, it may not be such a great place anytime soon to live. And there's no freedom in Cuba. The Cuban government has been accused of systematic human rights abuses, unfair trials, and extrajudicial execution. They also have been known to have a Cuban law that limits the freedom of expression, association, assembly, movement, and the press. In other words, if I was talking about Cuba this way out of my apartment in Havana and the government found out about it, I would either be arrested or worse. The economy of Cuba is another story. The Cuban government says that they follow socialism in a state-controlled planned economy. The production of the country is owned and run by the government. Everything that's made, everything that's sold is through the government. It's not through private companies. The labor force is controlled by the state. In other words, if I was growing up in Cuba and I wanted to be a baseball player, and for some reason the government found out about this and thought that I should be a factory worker, they can say, you are going to be a factory worker. They have that power. And any firm in the world that wants to hire a Cuban, not someone of Cuban descent living in Miami, I'm talking about a Cuban citizen in Cuba. If a company in, let's say, Italy wants to hire a Cuban, they have to go through the Cuban government, and they have to pay the Cuban government to get permission to hire this Cuban. Before the revolution and the coming to power of Castro, Cuba was one of the most successful Latin American nations. The country's economy was fueled by the sale of sugar to the U.S., and the country had grown very wealthy off of that. The U.S. embargo on Cuba is estimated to make the Cuban government, in other words, the nation of Cuba, lose $685 million a year. That's a tremendous amount of money. And Cuba's allies are Russia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Brazil, Colombia, and a few others that aren't necessarily allies but do support Cuba. And something very interesting about Cuba is they don't really pay for their oil. They get oil free from oil-rich Venezuela. And in return, Cuba, which has such a high volume of doctors, even though they barely get paid more than a factory worker, they send Cuban doctors to Venezuela to help in their healthcare system, which in my opinion, Venezuela doesn't have a healthcare system. They don't even have band-aids, they don't have blood, they don't have oxygen, they can't perform surgeries, many hospitals don't even have electricity. So, in my opinion, Latin America is in a lot of trouble. Brazil, of course, and Honduras and Mexico has some of the highest murder rates in the world. And it's said that Lebanon's Hezbollah even has connections to Cuba, and they send their fighters to Cuba for training. They also send them to Venezuela for training. So Cuba plays a very important role in the world today. I think it had a much bigger role years ago, but Cuba has such a history, and without Cuba, many things, Cuba just, it's had such a political position in the world over the years. And I definitely want to visit Cuba. I might wait for it to get a little bit safer for American tourists, but I hope to visit their great tobacco fields and see down to old Havana and smoke some cigars. So I hope you have enjoyed my video on Cuba today, and I hope you've learned something that you might not have known before. Thank you.